So it is the 10th of January 2019, China time, early hours of the morning. And today is George Foreman's birthday. Big George Foreman. In my mind, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. I'd have no problem having George Foreman in the top 10, um, top 12, and I wouldn't have him much beyond 12. I really think he's a very remarkable man. So I want to talk a little bit about his career and just how I feel that he's one of the most interesting boxers out there. I say boxers in the present tense. Of course, he's retired now, but he's really a remarkable figure in the sport. So, 70 years old today, that makes him the oldest living former world heavyweight champion. There are older guys who were big names in the 70s, like Ernie Shavers and a few others, but Foreman is the oldest former world heavyweight champion. So, let's have a brief look at his career and his life for that matter. Foreman started getting attention in the late 60s. He was slightly later into the game than his great contemporaries, of course, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. But he started becoming a considerable challenger in the early 70s. Then, of course, he gained its reputation as a power puncher. Foreman, of course, had first got recognition at the Mexico City Olympics. And there was that scene where he waved the little American flag, really making him a household name. So by the early 70s, he's one of the top contenders around. He hadn't at that point reached the sort of level of Ali or Frazier. Um, Probably not even Ken Norton at that point. But then, of course, came the Rumble in the Jungle, one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time. Certainly one of the most anticipated, one of the most unusual for its location, bearing in mind that the vast majority of famous fights have been in either Las Vegas, London, or New York City. Um, Very unusual location. Uh, I was going to say the Belgian Congo, Len Zaire, under the dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko. The documentary I believe it's called We Were Kings, about the Rumble in the Jungle is definitely worth watching. Um, so, early 70s, Foreman is seen as a power puncher. He came from a bit of a street thug background, to put it one way, which is kind of a caricature of a lot of boxers. So he had this kind of, I don't know if bad boy is the right word, but he had this menacing image as a bit of a thug. And it's interesting because if you actually look at interviews at that time in the 70s, Foreman came across as a pretty normal guy. So I think it's a case that his image didn't quite match the reality. It is true that he came from a troubled background, as do many fighters, but I think it was more sort of like later on emulated by Mike Tyson, sort of intimidating opponents before they even, before the first punch was even thrown. Um, I mean, the thing about the Rumble in the Jungle, it certainly cemented Ali's greatness because Foreman was such a feared fighter, because Ali was older, because Foreman was so powerful. Um, I think there's a few things that need to be considered about that. And this isn't to take away from Ali's achievement, but firstly, Ali had a psychological advantage in the sense that 99% of the crowd was on his side. When you have 60,000 people chanting Ali Bumbaye, Ali kill him, psychologically, you have to be a very powerful person to drown that out, as Foreman presumably did. He later described the fight as this mosquito was biting away at me and biting away at me, and eventually he got to me. And at one point, Ali said, "Is that all you got, George?" And he said, "Yeah, that's all I've got." So it's the stuff of legends. And that would have been the end of the Foreman saga. It would have been okay, dominant heavyweight in the early 70s, and that was it. But of course, that wasn't the end of the George Foreman saga. Um, After his loss to Jimmy Young in 1977, he described what was I believe Foreman described as a near-death experience. He hadn't acclimatized himself to the Puerto Rico heat. Um, Jimmy Young was a pretty good heavyweight. He often gets overshadowed by Ali, Foreman, Frazier, but I reckon Jimmy Young's easily in the top probably 10 heavyweights of the 70s. I think he's definitely an overlooked heavyweight. And he beat George Foreman. Now, yes, the climatization issue is a fact, but he did beat George Foreman. I think Jimmy Young's an overlooked heavyweight. But anyway, this video is not about Jimmy Young, it's about George Foreman. So, he had this near death experience. He then went to evangelism. He became an ordained minister in his native Texas. And then in 1987, at the age of 38, a full 10 years after retirement, following the loss to Jimmy Young, he took up boxing again. Everyone said it was a bad idea. This was before the time. Since then, we've had older fighters. Guys fighting in the 30s is no longer considered particularly old. Um, so he came back to the ring at the age of 38. Um, Speaking candidly, some of his opponents weren't exactly household names. His performances were fairly lackluster, but the power was always there. I've just watched the famous fight with Michael Moore, 1994. And Michael Moore was no journeyman. He was a pretty talented fighter. He was certainly one of the most capable heavyweights of the 90s. I wouldn't call him an all-time great, but he's certainly a pretty decent fighter, well above average. Um, and what happened? Throughout the fight, Moore dominated. Everyone wrote Big George off. Then that powerful shot, forget which round it was, but whoa. The fight itself wasn't particularly exciting. It wasn't particularly memorable, except for that last moment. And it's a case of, does one moment define a great fight, or does the whole fight define a great fight? I think no one can deny that the fight is very memorable. I would put it possibly second only to Buster Douglas defeating Mike Tyson as one of the greatest upsets of all time. Um, Foreman eventually retired in 1998, I believe, with a loss to Shannon Briggs. I may be wrong about this, but this is a man who'd been fighting for basically 4 decades: the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. That's an incredible thing. Becoming world heavyweight champion at 45 was astonishing. Um, and he said when he got back to boxing, he wanted to show that 40 is not a death sentence. I feel 5 years, half a decade after that, he became heavyweight champion of the world. So Foreman is really a remarkable figure, and it's inspiring for anyone who's maybe a bit older and they want to do things in life, particularly in sports. It's phenomenally inspiring, particularly such a physical and demanding sport as boxing. So I think it will be a very long time before any heavyweight surpasses that. Vladimir Klitschko tried, I believe, and Klitschko's a living legend. So if Klitschko could put up a good fight against Anthony Joshua at the age of 40, um, it puts into context just how good George Foreman was in that fight against Moore, or rather how he took the fight. His performance wasn't outstanding throughout the fight. He came across as slow. He looked his age, but then that power was still there. And this is not even to mention anything with his entrepreneurialism. The George Foreman grill was no gimmick. It would be very easy, and it's very often the case that you get boxers and other martial artists, you get in the wrestling business as well. They try to get into other endeavors, and it kind of looks a little bit embarrassing. But in the case of George Foreman, he was a successful entrepreneur. The George Foreman grill, of course, over 100 million units sold. Um, he has become a larger than life figure. And every interview I see with the man, he just comes across as very likable. I mean, this is a man who could have been very bitter. He was out of the sport for a full year, more than a year after the events in Kinshasa. I mean, that had a real psychological effect on him, understandably. And he could have ended up like a lot of fighters do, bitter, lonely, um, drug, alcohol problems, but He comes across to me as a happy, confident, and yet humble individual. Just a very likable guy. Of course, he worked for years as an HBO commentator. Um, so 70 today, George Foreman is a legend. His career, 76 wins, 5 losses. On paper, it's a bit of a mixed record. He had some not particularly outstanding moments. There were certain fights that, aren't exactly, don't go down as great fights or not his proudest moments. But you can't take anything away from a man who regains the World Heavyweight Championship at 45. It is the greatest comeback in boxing history. There's no question about that. And I think George Foreman will always be an inspiring figure. He is the last of that great trilogy, Ali, Frazier, Foreman. And you get guys like Norton and Shavers, Young, who were also big names in the 70s. But really, we associate that trilogy, Ali, Foreman, Frazier. And he's the last man standing. He's the last one. And I think George Foreman really is something special in the sport of boxing. There are few figures who have been as dominant in terms of presence in the sport. I'm not talking necessarily about greatness, but presence, to be involved for decades, either fighting or commentating. Well, actually, he continued commentating up until 2004, 1968 to 2004. That's 46 years this man was involved directly in boxing in some way or another. It's astonishing, almost half a century. Um, Bernard Hopkins just surpassed him to be the oldest boxer at light heavyweight to win a world championship. And, full respect to Bernard Hopkins. But I think Foreman is something special because after that loss in Kinshasa, 1974, 1994, it's a 20-year gap. I mean, who could have imagined in 1974, in that environment, that Foreman would have ever come back? So it's absolutely remarkable. And, huge respect to George Foreman. I'd have to rank him as one of my favorite boxers all round.